It seems like every week, if not every day, there's a new publication in the scientific literature that has something to do with nutrition and its risk of health issues down the road, most notably heart disease being a big one. And if you look at the percentage of those articles and publications that are against red meat, processed meat, fat, saturated fat, and those that are in favor of those factors, it seems very unbalanced, right? That the majority are against red meat, processed meat, saturated fat, and total fat. Now, the big question is, does this accurately reflect what the science should say? Does it accurately reflect the reality of food consumption and health risk? Or is it a factor of an inherent bias that is present within the scientific community, the health community, the nutritional community, and medical community? I mean, this is opinion, right? Not fact, this is opinion, but I believe it is truly due to an underlying bias. And I think what we need to do is be much more discerning about looking at these studies and looking at the details to say, one, does the strength of the study and the quality of the study really match the recommendation? And two, can we detect bias in the way that things are presented, even the data within the studies themselves, not just the media headlines. Those clearly are very prone to bias, but the data itself, is there bias that we can pick up in the data and the reporting? I want to go over a couple studies which really highlight this, because I think it's important because we all need to be educated consumers of scientific literature. So I'm Dr. Brett Schur, the medical director at DietDoctor.com, and hopefully that intro didn't put you to sleep. But I think it is important that it's hard to know who to trust on social media. It's hard to know who to trust when someone's just promoting a title or a conclusion or an abstract of a study without talking about the quality of the study or the details of the study. So part of my job and part of my mission is to help educate you as an individual to say, how can I look a little bit deeper at this study, or who can I follow to help me look a little bit deeper at this study? Because I think one of the biggest problems is we see these headlines, we see these conclusions, but what we don't know was it a good quality study? And what does this study mean for a population? But most importantly, what does it mean for you as an individual? And sometimes that's a little bit difficult to interpret from just abstracts, clickbait headlines, whatever the case may be. So let's talk about the first study that recently came out. It was published in Critical Reviews in Food Science and Nutrition with the title of Meat Consumption and Risk of Ischemic Heart Disease, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And if you look at the conclusion, there were 13 published articles that were included. Now, these were not randomized controlled trials. These were observational trials, nutritional epidemiology studies. So right away, we know we're dealing with the lowest quality of scientific evidence, basically, that we can get. Nutritional epidemiology, it's not that it's zero evidence, it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's pretty low quality. And we've talked about this before, from food frequency questionnaires being a poor way to have accurate information, healthy user bias being impossible to control for and can really account for the majority of findings in most of these studies, and the very small hazard ratios, which show really minimal impact, if any at all, for the meat versus non-meat or the comparison groups, right? So, because I misspoke, it's not an intervention, and that's the important part, it's just an observation. So we already know we're dealing with that in 13 of these trials. So what they conclude is higher consumption of unprocessed red meat was associated with a 9% relative risk increase for ischemic heart disease, and processed meat had an 18% higher risk of ischemic heart disease, with no association with poultry. So here's the next part, though. This study provides substantial evidence that unprocessed red and processed meat, though not poultry, might be risk factors for ischemic heart disease. Substantial evidence. I think that's a pretty strong word for something that has a hazard ratio of 1.09, so that's a 9% relative increased risk, or 1.18 at its strongest, right? And I like to make this analogy because when smoking and when they evaluated smoking and cancer with observational studies, not interventional studies, observational studies, the hazard ratios were between 15 and 30, not 1.15 or 1.30, but 30. And here we're talking about 1.18. Like it couldn't really get much smaller. Now, but I started this by talking about bias, right? Like, can we detect bias? Well, right away, substantial evidence, I think, is bias. And I want to jump all the way to the end of this article here. So they say most of the included studies use food frequency questionnaires to assess dietary intake, which are subject to both random and systematic error and can reduce the power to detect associations. Similarly, most studies only used one measurement of diet, which can lead to regression dilution bias and the underestimation of the association. So right away, they're acknowledging that the data input is pretty poor. I mean, it's really low quality data input, so you have to be very careful about how you can interpret these. Another potential limitation is the inconsistency of meat classification between the studies. For instance, some studies included processed chicken in their processed meat definition and some did not, and many did not clearly specify their definition criteria. Okay, so basically, if you skip to this section, you're saying you don't know what the data says. You have no idea what's included in the data. You know that the data acquisition is very poor quality, but the definitions of what even you define as red meat, processed meat, we don't even know what those are. So how can we make many meaningful conclusions about this? Is, a burger and fries one thing? Spaghetti with a meat sauce that has tons of sugar, spinach salad with grass-fed steak on it, or just, steak or lamb grilled with olive oil or butter served with veggies. Like, those are totally different things. Chicken nuggets versus a sausage that has no fillers, no breading, no soy, no sugar, but just is just a plain, as clean as you can get sausage. We don't know how any of those are dealt with. So this gets down to, what does this mean for you as an individual? So again, in the conclusion, to say this provides substantial evidence to the harms of these foods when we don't even know what the foods are, to me, that's a sign of bias. But it goes even further. And this was actually pointed out by George Henderson on Twitter. When you look at the graphs they included in the study, or the plots they included in the study versus the ones that are in the supplemental material, kind of the most important ones are in the supplemental material, which show a huge variation in the results of the study, but you have to dig to find them. They didn't include it in the majority of the data there. And when you look at the plot, the relative risks for ischemic heart disease for high versus low processed meat, what you get is an overall 1.11 risk. I mean, that's just tiny. But when you look at the differences, there's a 1.28, there's a 0.98, 0.56, 1.04, 0.95, 0.84, with anything being less than 1 trending towards benefit and anything being more than 1 trending towards harm, with the magnitude of the variation from 0 showing a likely higher association, but also the confidence intervals. So they list the confidence intervals, and if it crosses 1, it's non-significant. So the majority of these studies cross 1, although there's one that was beneficial and did not cross 1, but the majority cross 1, and when you factor them all together, you're left with a 1.1. It doesn't get much weaker than that, but yet the conclusion was substantial evidence. And the same is for unprocessed red meat, where they get 1.12. And again, the variations from being below 1 and above 1 on the hazard ratios for the different studies is pretty significant. And it's really only significant when you're comparing the absolute highest quartile to the absolute lowest quartile without a meaningful difference in between them, the second, third, and fourth quartiles. So is it really something to do with the meat itself, or do you think it has to do with who the person is who's eating that highest quartile versus who that person is eating the lowest quartile? So, okay, I'm belaboring this, but the point of this whole conversation was bias. So this one, I think, is so clear that there's bias in the interpretation, there's a bias in the reporting of the data, and there's bias in certainly the media presentation of this. And that's a concern, because if all you're doing is reading headlines and responding to the abstract and responding to the conclusions that it provides substantial evidence to the harms of unprocessed and processed red meat, you're left believing it. But we have to all learn how to dig a little bit deeper and look at the details of the study. And when you look at the limitations, when you look at the low hazard ratios, what does this mean to you as an individual? I got to say, absolutely nothing. And so this really doesn't contribute much to the science at all and only confuses people. And I hate to see that. But now let's take a look at a second study that also strongly shows how bias is present in the reporting of data. This one I found really interesting. It was a publication by Tim Noakes in BMJ Open Heart. And it says, hiding unhealthy heart outcomes in a low-fat diet trial. the Women's Health Initiative randomized controlled dietary modification trial finds that postmenopausal women with established coronary heart disease were at increased risk of an adverse outcome if they consumed a low-fat, heart-healthy diet. So, long title, but basically, it's all talking about the Women's Health Initiative trial, which started way back in the 90s, randomizing women to a control higher-fat diet or a intervention low-fat diet, trying to get down to 20% of their calories from fat. And what was reported in the study was that there was no association with increased or decreased risk of heart disease. That didn't matter if you were in the higher fat or lower fat group, your risk of heart disease was no different. But here's what's interesting. As Tim Noakes points out, there was a difference in the women who had pre-existing heart disease and those who did not. And when you look at the graph that they included in the trial, they show all participants and they show participants without a history of cardiovascular disease. And what they show was for all participants, there was no significant difference, as I said. And for those participants without a history of cardiovascular disease, in some groups, there was a very small benefit to the lower fat diet. But what did they leave out? They left out mentioning in this graph the participants with a history of heart disease. Now, they did mention it in the text, so you sort of have to dig for it. The hazard ratio for the 3.4% of the women who had cardiovascular disease at baseline was 1.26, which means there was an increased risk of having cardiovascular events in those women who followed the lower fat intervention diet compared to those who followed the higher fat control diet. A higher risk in the intervention group, but it was sort of buried in the text, not in the graph. And what they said was, we considered the potential confounding effects of changing medication use during the trial by examining use of statins, aspirin, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors at year 6, and all differences in medication use between groups were less than 1%. So basically saying there was not a significant difference in the medication use in the groups. But they don't talk about that much more. It's not in the abstract. It's really not in the conclusion. They don't promote that part of the study because it goes against the narrative. It goes against what they thought they would find. It goes against what the common teaching is. So it's buried. Bias in publication. To me, that seems pretty clear. And they go further by saying this may be a chance observation, or rates in the small subset may be confounded by current therapies or comorbid conditions. So they try to explain it, right? It's a randomized controlled trial. They don't try and explain away any beneficial findings. They try and explain away the findings that don't fit their narrative or their belief or the common belief at the time. Now, there were two subsequent publications that Dr. Noakes mentions in his paper, one in 2017 and one in 2019. And what they showed there was the risk of developing cardiovascular disease for those women who had pre-existing cardiovascular disease and were randomized to the lower fat group only increased. It was a 26% relative risk at the first publication at 5 years, and subsequently went up to 47 and 61% relative risk increase. And again, they tried to explain it with saying they were on fewer statins or they didn't comply with the diet. And in his paper, Professor Noakes goes through how those are actually not true. But they're rationalizations. So again, trying to rationalize findings that don't fit with the bias or the common narrative. And I don't know, to me, I have a problem with that because that's not good science. You have to acknowledge what a randomized controlled trial found and then the observation that follows many years later. You have to acknowledge what that shows. You can talk about the quality of evidence, but you don't try and dismiss it if it doesn't fit your narrative. So this is I guess a little depressing to point out how rampant bias in publications are. And look, if it's someone like me promoting a bias, I believe that red meat is not harmful to health, especially when part of a healthy lifestyle and part of a healthy diet. And I don't think that reducing fat is a good intervention for the majority of people. So when I report findings of studies, okay, yeah, my bias is to look for those that show that to be the case, or very poor quality studies that show it not to be the case, but then to point out the poor quality, right? That's my bias. So, but I hope that my bias is reflected in really trying to get to the strength of the science. That's what I want to show. So everybody comes at it with bias, but who should not come at it with bias is those who are writing the papers, those who are doing the research, those who are doing the publications. And that's where it gets a little concerning. And unfortunately, I think we have some pretty good examples that were brought up just this past week of bias in science and in publications. So how do we wrap up this kind of depressing video here about bias all around us? Well, hopefully it's to raise your antenna, that when you see these headlines, you have to say, okay, yeah, but, or yes, and go a little deeper. Don't react to headlines. Don't react to abstracts even, but look for someone doing an evaluation of the studies. Look for someone showing you the pros and cons of the studies, or if you have the time or the interest, do it yourself. Look into the studies and find out what the weaknesses are, and try and get a sense of what is the strength of the evidence and what does this mean to me as an individual. And I think we conclude that there's a strong anti-meat, anti-saturated fat bias, and I can certainly conclude that the strength of the science does not back the strength of the recommendation. Now, does that mean everybody everywhere can eat as much saturated fat as they want, can eat as much red meat as they want? Well, that might not be the case either, especially if you have a poor baseline diet, you're eating a mixed high-carb, high-fat diet, you're a smoker, you don't exercise, maybe there's a role there that does exist. I don't know, because that's really all that the studies show, but it doesn't show mechanisms. But if you're following a healthy diet, if you're living a healthy lifestyle, I don't see any evidence that saturated fat, red meat are harmful. And then when we talk about processed meat, we really need to know what we're talking about. Are we talking about breaded chicken nuggets? Are we talking about sausages that have lots of fillers and carbs and sugar and soy? Or are we talking about a very clean processed food which doesn't have any of those added fillers? Because that makes a difference. All right, so hopefully this at least raise your antenna, get you focusing a little bit more on what these studies show and how to interpret them. And so if you thought this was helpful, hit the thumbs up and the subscribe button so you'll get all our updates here on Diet Doctor News on YouTube. All right, thanks a lot, everybody.